through 1 Samuel, then 2 Samuel, and here we are in 2 Samuel chapter 15. Seems like years and years and years later, but there's a lot of information in 1 and 2 Samuel up to this point. If you do not know, I've mentioned it before, when we are complete with 2 Samuel, when we've worked all our way through, there's 24 chapters, I believe, 24 chapters in 2 Samuel. When we're done, we're going to begin the book of James. So I'm getting ready for that, reading through James, writing a background for James now, thinking about this, and really looking forward to the book of James. It's a great book. It's going to be a lot of fun working through that. Very convicting as well. Well, we began last week looking at verse 13 of chapter 15, because at verse 13 is where David begins to flee. The exile begins. He leaves Jerusalem because Absalom, his son, is attempting a takeover. So you have the revolt of Absalom in the first 12 verses, and then the exile begins in chapter 15, and in the last verse of chapter 19, David is finally has returned back to Jerusalem, and guess what happens in chapter 20? Another revolt, the revolt of Sheba. We'll see that when we get there. But when David leaves here, he meets several people. Ittai, Zadok, those are two men. Well, we met Ittai last week. He meets 5 different men as he leaves the city, and we're going to find that in chapter 19, verses 9 through 43, when he returns, he's going to meet 5 more men. Not all of these men are going to be favorable to David, and we'll see that. But we began with the context, and the context, of course, is David's ruling, and it's probably 22 or so years later after he's been reigning over Judah. Remember chapter 5 in verses 1, 2, and 3, he reigned over Judah for 7.5 years. Finally, Israel came to him and said, "We want you to be our king. You're the one who's led Israel out. Even while Saul was king, we recognize that it was you that the Lord blessed, and you led us out to battle." So 7.5 years plus 22 or so, 20 to 22 years. So we're looking at 30 years into David's reign, a little bit more than 30 years, probably somewhere in 28 to 32 years. He's got about 8 to 10 more years of being a king before he dies. We know that he reigns for 40 years. So after all of Israel comes to David in Hebron after 7.5 years, and they say to him, "We want you to be the ruler over all of Israel." 22 years later, he hears these words in verse 13. "The messenger came to David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Been a complete reversal. We want you as our king. 22 years later, we do not want you as our king. We want Absalom. That's what David is facing. And we noted that David did not question the messenger. He must have trusted the messenger. He did not show any suspicion or any doubt at all to what the messenger said. He simply said this. He said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us go, let us flee. Otherwise, none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So David is very convinced that Absalom is capable of this kind of stuff, which must have been very discouraging to David, that he was not only ready, but in the mind of David, my son is capable of killing a lot of people in order to get the throne. We always hear, "Well, my child is good. They're good. They would never do that." David knew Absalom would do that. That's why he ran. So, as he collects people, the first objective, of course, is to make a hasty eastward departure from Jerusalem. That's in verses 16 and 17. So he's going the opposite direction of Hebron. He's trying to put as much distance between him and Absalom as he can. as many terrain features as he can. The second objective was to leave a small group of non-military personnel who would manage the royal residence in Jerusalem, and so he left 10 concubines there. And while it was perhaps an okay or an admirable thing in which David did, what he did without realizing was set the stage for the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy that Absalom would lie with David's wives in broad daylight. That was mentioned back in chapter 12 and verse 11, and it actually does happen in chapter 16, verse 21 and 22. We noted that the Pelethites and the Carathites are always mentioned. Those bodyguards that David hired, they're always mentioned together, and only in the time of David. Evidently, Solomon, his son, did not use these groups, hire these groups as bodyguards, but David did. David had a lot of interaction with the Philistines, either fighting them or running to them for safety from Saul. But there was at least a workable relationship between David and the Philistines. So evidently he had hired these two groups to be bodyguards for him, and they were extremely loyal to him. To their credit, they were very loyal. And in verses 19 through 22, there we met the man Ittai, the Gittite, and he says, "Why will you go with me? Why will you go along with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile. Return to your place." And he says, "You've only come here yesterday, and shall I today make you wander with us while I go where I will? Return, take back your brothers. Mercy and truth be upon you." But Ittai is devoted to David. Evidently, he had been recently hired as a bodyguard of sort. There were 600 people with him, the text tells us, and evidently they are committed to David. So Ittai says, I really don't want to do that. In verse 21, "As the Lord lives and as my Lord lives," two oaths based on two people right there. "Surely wherever my Lord the king may be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." So he says, "Very well, go and pass over." He passed over, verse 22, with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. Evidently he had families. Remember, David had the same thing. David had 600 men with all his families. Remember that when Saul was chasing him around? So these are Gentiles. There's no doubt these are Gentiles. Perhaps they are outcasts, a political outcast of some country for whatever reason, and they have found a home with David. So, verse 23, "While all the country was weeping loud, with a loud voice, all the people passed over. The king also passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness." So we're at this point now where, looking at verse 23, for example, I think I just read verse 23. David crossed the Kidron Valley, and then he passed over toward the way of the wilderness. He's going in the direction of Jericho, opposite of Hebron. That brook Kidron, you come down out of Jerusalem, you go down the brook Kidron, and then you go up the Mount of Olives. So when you cross that brook, he's going to make his way to the top of the Mount of Olives, and he's going to meet somebody there, and he's putting as many terrain features and distance as he can between him and Solomon. We also mentioned last time that 10 centuries later, the son of David, capital S, the son of David, our Lord Jesus, would cross the same valley on the night of his arrest and betrayal. John chapter 18 and verse 1. So at this point, David is a king without a capital city, but he was not without supportive citizens. All the countryside, all the country was weeping aloud with him as David's entourage passed over. They did not want David to leave. Evidently, this means they did not want Absalom to be on the throne. For whatever reason, they were afraid of Absalom. Perhaps they knew that Absalom was not God's choice for the king to follow David. And they knew that somebody who would sit on the throne who's not called to sit on the throne means trouble for everyone. If you're not supposed to be there, then things usually don't go well. So here we are at verse 24, looking at 24 through 29. So let's read that. Now behold, Zadok also came, and all the Levites with him, carrying the ark of the covenant, and they sat down the ark of God, and Abiathar came up until all the people had finished passing from the city. The king said to Zadok, return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he should say, thus I have no delight in him, behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. The king said also to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I am going to wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark of God to Jerusalem and remained there. I'll stop right there and make some comments here. A major portion of David's support at this time came from the religious community. David was a man who had always shown great respect and reverence for the priests. Remember, it was Saul who killed those 85 priests at Nob. Remember that? They had aided David and allowed him to get away, or aided him in his escape from Saul. And in Saul's anger, he had all 85 of those priests killed. But David had always shown reverent respect, consistently provided support for the Levites in the past. Now, in his own hour of need, Zadok also came, it says in verse 24, accompanied by all the Levites with him. And their support meant that the religious authorities of the kingdom were wholeheartedly on David's side. So David's possession of the ark would demonstrate that he alone possessed divine favor and necessary to rule Israel. He needed God's blessings, and the ark represented God's blessings, is what David said. Representing God's blessings, he would no doubt be a show to all the people and be a sign to all the people that what Absalom is doing was wrong, but David was not going to have it that way. And by the way, at no point do we hear that Absalom had the support or guidance of any priest or prophet throughout the whole time. You remember when David had brought the ark to Jerusalem, chapter 6? Remember, he carried it. Was carrying it, and it teetered one time because it was on the wrong kind of cart. Uzzah touched it to steady it. Uzzah was knocked over. God disciplined him immediately. David was angry. He set it aside for a while until he figured out the right way to carry it, and then he brought it in. All that happened in chapter 6. And David brought the ark to Jerusalem because he believed that he was fulfilling a prophecy in the law. Chapter 12 of Deuteronomy in verse 5. The Lord had chosen Jerusalem as the place where he would cause his name to rest. Jerusalem was going to be a place of peace and of rest. And seeing the ark leave the designated city, in David's eyes, was wrong. This is not right here. The ark should stay here because this is where God has chosen to reign. So it does not need to leave here. This was the city from which God would rule. God himself had chosen the city, and David was convinced of that truth, so much so that he said it needs to stay here. If the Lord will show pleasure and have pleasure in me reigning again from Jerusalem, then he will bring me back. If not, then what does he say? Let him do to me as seems good to him, verse 26. So God was the true ruler of Israel. In addition, David is wise enough to know the location of the ark means nothing so far as God's choice. That's key. David knows, you keep the ark here, this is where it belongs. If the Lord wants me to reign, then he'll bring me back. That's good on David's part. He's wise enough to realize the location of the ark doesn't mean anything as far as God's choice. Once leaders in Israel thought the ark was a kind of rabbit foot. You remember when that took place? Chapter 3 of 1 Samuel. I know why we lost to the Philistines. Because we didn't have the ark. Well, let's take the ark into the battle next time. So they did, and they still lost, and they stole the ark. Remember? And then they put it in Dagon's temple, and Dagon would fall over. Well, there was a time when leaders in Israel thought the ark was a kind of rabbit foot. Good luck charm sort of thing. And this is another example of what it means to be a man after God's own heart, what David did here. The conviction that God was sovereign, even in these turbulent times, was a guide to behavior. He knew, he was convinced that if God wanted him on the throne, he would be there again. And so, why take the ark? Why take the symbol of God's presence out of where we know God is going to reign, the city he's chosen himself? Leave it here. Accordingly, the king ordered Zadok to take the ark of God back into the city. In verse 25, Zadok and the Levites apparently had carried the ark to support David's right by God's choice, and this line of reasoning was not acceptable. The ark would not be used as a charm or a means of coercing the Lord to favor David. Therefore, he was not willing to insist on his right to rule. If God wished to replace David, then God will do so, even with Absalom. Then if that is going to be the case, then no human plan could change God's good purpose. David knew that, and he knew that taking the ark would not change God's plan. If the king found favor in the Lord's eyes, then the Lord would bring him back, and he would let him see it and his dwelling place again. If the Lord were not pleased with David, then let him do to me whatsoever seems good to him, or whatever seems good to him. A better response would be difficult to attain. A better response than David had at this point right here. David submits to God's will, and here is a model for all leaders of God's people in this difficult time. I'm afraid that I will lose my throne. I will lose my kingdom. You don't do wrong. You don't conduct unethical activities and do what is wrong because you are afraid of losing your throne. Because you just might lose it by doing those things. You need to trust God. You need to do the right thing. And the right thing is, you don't need the ark. The ark's not going to persuade me, change my mind, or manipulate me in any way. Leave it here. It's where it belongs. If I want you back on my throne, God says, I will put you back on my throne. So David's response in verse 26 would be difficult to improve on. About this time, one can almost see a light turn on in David's head. Verses 27 through 29. Besides ordering the return of the Ark of the Covenant, David ordered Zadok, whom David also recognized as a seer, prophet-like guy, to go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. They would serve as spies, secretly providing David with vital intelligence regarding Absalom's plans and movements. I've got moles inside here. We're going to develop an underground system where you can drop messages at certain places and other people will pick them up, and we'll that way I'll know what Absalom is planning. Kind of we're going to crack their code so that we know what they're going to do before they actually do it. So as David planned it, he and his entourage would wait at the fords in the desert. Ford is a place where people and animals can cross a stream. David is going to wait there near Jericho for information regarding Absalom's strategy. So Zadok and Abiathar agreed to the plan, and they returned with the ark. Evidently, Absalom would not have questioned their loyalty, since their loyalty is to the Lord their God, not to a man necessarily. So verse 30 and 31. David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. Now someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. Now there's a valid prayer, and it's probably 3 or 4 seconds long. Our text this morning was Matthew 6, 5 through 8. Long prayers. They do it to be seen by men and to manipulate God. And long prayers do not mean something that's pleasing to God. And so here's a very short prayer on David's part. So walking out of the Kidron Valley, David and all his people here continued up the slope of Olives. There's really no mount in the text there. It's just they walking up the slope of Olives is what it says in verse 30. As they moved eastward toward the Jordan River, they were doing this. Now look over at Psalm 3. Sometimes it's very difficult, if not impossible, to discern when David penned it, what historical situation was going on when David penned these psalms, but sometimes they tell us. Psalm 3, you see what it says in that small print above Psalm 3? A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. How about that? So as he's fleeing from his son, here's the psalm he has written. O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Remember back in chapter 15, verse 13, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people. So as he's fleeing from his son, you get hopefully a better flavor of when he's writing Psalm 3. My enemies in that case happens to be his own soldiers and his own son. So David made no attempt to hide his distress from all the people around him. He's weeping, he's walking barefooted, and he has his head covered. He has much reason to weep. He had brought sorrow and death to his family. This is David had done this to himself. Amnon had been murdered, Tamar raped, and now Absalom, his own son, was proceeding down a path that meant certain death for his son. David knows that Solomon is going to be the one that reigns on the throne, not Absalom. For Absalom to jump ahead of Solomon, to force his way up there, is not going to end well. David knows it. He knows this. People once trusted Ahithophel. People who once trusted him, David, that is, they're now following Ahithophel, an egotistical rebel who will never be king. Well, excuse me, let me say it this way. People once trusted Ahithophel, for example, were following an egotistical rebel who would never be king. That's what I intended when I wrote that. Ahithophel is an example of one who once trusted, but is now following an egotistical rebel. So David covering his head and going about barefoot were both considered expressions of grief, shame, and despair and sorrow in ancient Israelite society. An example of that would be Esther, chapter 6 and verse 12, Jeremiah 14, verses 3 and 4. These expressions were a humble confession that the trouble was deserved. Humble expressions that the trouble was deserved. David's not making excuses. David is not whining like a big baby. Oh, woe is me. Why is God doing all of this? I thought he said he forgave me. Not a matter of forgiveness. It's the effects of sin. David being who he was, it was a great amount of responsibility. You think about it. You remember, God did not let Moses into the promised land because he did what? Disobeyed. That bottom line is he disobeyed. And a leader, a great leader as Moses, in front of all of those people, showed a measure of disrespect for God in front of all those people. Now, why didn't God just forgive him? All he did was hit the rock. He should have, touched it and he hit it, right? All he had to do is, that's an easy, Moses, don't do that again. But Moses, being who he was, disrespected the Lord's instructions in front of millions, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so there's a consequence, a commensurate consequence for doing that. He was never allowed to step into the promised land. Same thing with David. David did something, and it has in front of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And that's what, remember Nathan said, because you have given the enemies of God an occasion to blaspheme. Wow. Commensurate to all of this is these things are going to happen. So David is not whining here at all. The burden of responsibility for the people as well fell on David's shoulders. God entrusted Israel to him. He called him to shepherd his people, Israel. Their peace, shalom, their peace was his responsibility. And look at it now. There's a coup attempt. People are crying and wailing because of what's going to happen. Absalom is very capable of killing these people. God has entrusted the peace of these people to me. And look what I've caused. Probably indicative of his guilt, David's guilt, is the fact that David wanted to send someone who sided with him back to Jerusalem, such as Ittai, the priest, and we're going to read about another man here in just a minute by the name of Hushai. Out of sympathy for their king, those accompanying David followed his example, and they showed great mourning, great signs of grief and shame and despair and sorrow. Compounding David's woes was the news that Ahithophel, David's most valued counselor, was among the conspirators with Absalom. I have written down here Psalm 41, verse 9. Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. It's a psalm of David. Could David be referring to Ahithophel? It's possible. I'm not aware if there is another man in whom David was extremely close. But Ahithophel was one of David's most valued counselors. And what do you do? What do you do when one of your closest friends betrays you? You worship. Verse 31 of our text. You worship. O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. Psalm 55 in verses 12 through 15. I think it's very interesting and helpful for us understanding the character of our God, understanding the Bible when we can connect real historical occasions to the Psalms that he writes. Sometimes the Psalms are written and we can't quite jump into his shoes. We don't know exactly what the context was. So when he says things like, I could hide myself from him, but it's you. As for me, I shall call upon God. He's like, what's causing him? What's motivating him to do that? To understand some of the history or the circumstances behind the writing is very helpful. Psalm 55, verses 12 through 15. For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, and my familiar friend. We who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng. Let death come deceitfully upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol, for evil is in their dwelling in their midst. Could David be, again, describing the betrayal of some of his closest friends? Verses 32 through the remainder of the chapter, 37. It happened as David was coming to the summit, so he's just before he gets out of the city, he meets Ittai, and deals with them, all those people. And then just before he gets to the brook, he meets Zadok and Abiathar. He addresses and talks with them. Now he's going up the hill, and he's showing signs of grief and shame with his head covered, and he's barefooted, and everybody else is doing the same thing, following suit. Then verse 32, as David was coming to the summit of the Olives. So he's getting to the top there, where God was worshipped. Evidently there was a place up there where people was their practice to worship. That behold, Hushai the Archite met him with his coat torn and dust on his head. David said to him, if you pass over with me, then you will be a burden to me. Not the most encouraging thing to say, huh? But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so I will now be your servant. Then you can thwart the counsel of Ahithophel for me. Are not Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, with you there? So it shall be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall report to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Behold, their 2 sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them you shall send me everything that you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. Evidently, after this prayer, it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. After this prayer that David prayed here, he got to the top of the hill, he saw Hushai, and evidently the Lord moved David in some way to recognize, here's the answer to your prayer right here. And David doesn't hesitate. According to the text here, he says, if you pass over with me, then you're going to be a burden to me. Well, thanks, David. But if you do this, then you can be a great asset for us. He's asking Hushai to do extremely difficult thing. He's asking him to be, of course, an infiltrator and pretend he's loyal to Absalom all the while he's not. That's a very dangerous place to be, because if he is discovered for what he's really doing, if he is seen with Jonathan, giving Jonathan a message or something like that, and they discover that, Hushai is gone. He's dead. Very quickly, probably, and they'll put his head on a pole to show everybody else, here's what happens if you try to rebel against me. So the answer to David's prayer came in the next verse, in the next event. It came in a man named Hushai. The Lord was very much aware of the events, God was, and he provided a quick answer. He also mourning, Hushai was, had been waiting for David at the top of the mount. He is referred to as an Archite, which means Hushai was a Gentile, a tribe descended from Canaan. So he and Ittai were both Gentiles. The town of Archa was located in Syria, about 200 miles north of Damascus and 5 miles east of the city. The text says that he was a friend of David, but really, how could he know? 1 Chronicles 27:33 mentions him as well. Well, a foxhole is not for everyone. You know, it takes, for every soldier in the foxhole, it takes, boy, it's like, I think I heard something like 7 guys behind him to keep him out there. Keep him fed, keep him supplied, keep him healthy, keep him informed, all these kinds of things that are going on. So a foxhole is not for everyone. David realized the real value was in Hushai's ability to gather intelligence. A fugitive does not need a complex and long logistical train to maintain. David, I don't need this. Just a bunch of guys means I can't move very fast, means I make a lot of dust whenever I move, which makes it easier for people to find me. Don't need that. So, what David says sounds unthankful for support, but David quickly told him that if you go with me, you're going to be a burden to me. Perhaps Hushai was handicapped in some way, or simply too old to travel light and fast. Maybe that's the case. Some of the commentators suggest that maybe those are some of the reasons. Maybe that's some of the reason that David said immediately to Hushai, if you go with me, you're going to be a burden. Look, you're 70 years old. You can't move fast. Now, look, David, it's interesting, though, that because David is no spring chicken. If our dates are right here, David is 10 years, 12 years at the most from dying in his old age. When he gets old, when David gets old, his body can't retain the heat, and so they have problems keeping him warm, and so they put a lot of blankets on him. So David is not that far from being where he can't travel very fast as well. But some of the commentators say perhaps Hushai was handicapped in some way or just too old to travel light and fast. The history of Hushai's service could work in favor of David. He's noted as a friend, and so obviously he's proved himself faithful up to this point. He was likely to be treated as a valued asset in Absalom's government. Since he had served with David for so long, then he would be a valued asset in Absalom's government because he would know a lot of things in which other people did not know. And that might be valuable to Absalom. He knows the priest. He knows how to move in the palace. This is Hushai. What are some of his advantages? Well, he knows the palace well. He knows Zadok and Abiathar. He knows if there are secret passages of escape somewhere. If Absalom doesn't know them, Hushai certainly does. So he also would know how to move in the palace without being suspected. He knows the less traveled paths in and out of the city, and he knows the common routine of daily events. That meant he could act uncommonly, potentially without detection. So he knows all of these things. Hushai must have been a wise man because David trusted him to counter Ahithophel's advice. That's really interesting. If Ahithophel was regarded as one of the wisest men in the day, highly valued counsel came from this man. So if he's asked Hushai to do this, then he must have been a wise man in his own right, because David trusted him to counter Ahithophel's advice. Now, Ahithophel was no lightweight. If you flip over a page, chapter 16, verse 23. The advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded by both David and Absalom. Both David and Absalom evidently had high regard for this guy. He was considered to have the wisdom of God when you ask his counsel. So Ahithophel is no lightweight here. And as it turns out, Hushai accepted David's plan, though it was with a high degree of risk for him. As we noted, if his true intentions were discovered, he would have been swiftly executed. His willingness to put himself at risk for David's sake reveals the depth of commitment that he had toward his king. It's stunning. That's an amazing level of commitment. Hushai was a Gentile. He brings to mind the centurion in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5. And Jesus said of him, "Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel." And people say, well, only the Jews in the Old Testament were saved and Gentiles could not be saved. Oh, that's so far from true, accurate. There were great men of faith in the Old Testament who were not Jews. Naomi is one of them. Rahab, the harlot. It's just some of the people were just amazing in their degree of faith that were not Jews. And evidently, and when Jesus was on earth, there was a centurion of which he says, "I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel." So Hushai would not only be, he would not be the only mole in Jerusalem. Joining him in the deception, of course, would be the two priests. However, there was a difference between the role that Hushai would play and that which the others carried out. Only Hushai would have a presence in the king's place or in the king's palace. The priestly obligations of Zadok and Abiathar would keep them away from the king most of the time. It was going to be up to Hushai himself to learn and hopefully influence the new government strategies regarding David. Hushai is going to be right there in the planning room with everybody else. Once he acquired this coveted information, he would then be responsible to tell Zadok and Abiathar anything of strategic value that he might hear, and in turn their sons would be given this information and would act as couriers in relaying it to David. Now, there's no doubt Absalom had guys stationed outside the city on the walls, and they had to come up with ways of getting out of town, having reasons to go out of town with information and things. David escaped from the forces of Absalom by the narrowest of margins. It's difficult to see that in the text, but it says that. After Hushai left David and made the 1 mile walk back to the royal city from the top of the Mount of Olives, a journey of no more than half an hour, Absalom was entering the city. So what the text means here is that it says something like this: "And Hushai came into the city while Absalom entered Jerusalem." It's evidently, what the text means is they're entering the city from two different directions. This from the north, this from the Hebron section, evidently at the same time. So Absalom would not know that Hushai had left or had recently walked in. Perhaps they met somewhere in the middle and they greeted one another. And of course, Hushai would have bowed himself to Absalom and convinced Absalom that he was here to serve him just like he served his father David. At that vulnerable moment, David and his followers were separated from Absalom's forces by only one hill. If there is anything, one commentator said this: if there is anything better than getting an answer to prayer, it's being an answer to prayer. There's a lot of joy in being an answer to prayer. And Hushai was an answer to David's prayer. And so they go into the city almost at the same time. In chapter 16, David is going to continue his departure, his running from Absalom, and he's going to meet Ziba next. Remember, there's 5 people. Ittai, Zadok, Hushai. Now he's going to meet Ziba and Shimei. And Ziba and Shimei are not going to be good people. So next week, I believe it's 1 through 14. Chapter 16, 1 through 14 next week. Is this not good stuff? Oh yeah, it's good stuff. Go ahead, admit it. It's all right.